I think for me, first of all, I'd like to thank Demola very, very much for the opportunity, and folks who are on the call. Just in terms of my presentation style, I mean, if you have any questions as we go along, if you'd like to contribute something as we go along, I'm really more than happy to do so, and I really welcome engagement and discussion on this. A little bit about myself. So there are two things that I am incredibly passionate about. First and foremost, I'm incredibly passionate about the African continent. I've been to Nigeria. I've spent time in Nigeria, particularly in Lagos, and it's the most electric city on earth. And I'm incredibly passionate about the potential that Africa has, and in particular West Africa has, to add incredible value to the rest of the world and the rest of the continent. So when opportunities like this come up, to be able to present some of my ideas and the ideas of others to an audience, I see that as my responsibility to contribute towards thought leadership, particularly with regards to my second passion, which is really around learning and learning and development in particular. And I see so many organizations trying to do the right thing when it comes to learning and development, but often not necessarily having the skills and the competencies to be able to actually execute on that plan. And it's tough for learning professionals in organizations. You know, I make no mistake about that. Often, you know, we are faced with a real struggle to get budget to drive effective learning interventions in our organizations. So really what my approach is to say, okay, how can we think a little bit more creatively? How can we think a little bit more entrepreneurially and use the limited resources that we have at hand to be able to add incredible value to people in the organization, using learning as our tool. So sometimes a learning program or mentorship or coaching is not necessarily the correct approach. Sometimes it's not a learning intervention that is needed. However, if we are able to understand and ascertain that the need of our line client in the business is in fact learning related, then we've got the opportunity to start to add some real value there. And, you know, Demola and I were just discussing the other day the transition of learning professionals and the learning and development function, moving from learning or L&D being an order taker to L&D being much more of a producer of solutions. And that's an absolutely critical transition in terms of what is happening in the learning and development function globally. So I will bring that into the presentation that I've got for you this morning. And really, you know, I don't have all that many slides. I prefer to take much more of an open discussion-based or presentation-based approach to this kind of work. So my slides are pretty minimal. And I've only got one slide for you that is quite busy and quite complicated, and I will take the time to explain the content on that slide. So before we kick off, I wanted to find out, are we good? Are we happy? Are there any questions or provocations or anything that you'd like me to focus on from the get-go? Okay, well, if anything comes up, please feel free to just pop that into the chat, unmute yourself, say what's on your mind, and we'll discuss it. Alrighty. Demola, I just wanted to double check. Can you see my slides nice and clearly?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let us get underway. So, this is such an important piece of research that has recently been done by an organization called Qualtrics. In recent research performed by Qualtrics, 32% of employees prefer formal learning or mentoring over on-the-job learning experiences. This is such an interesting piece of research, and it really goes against a lot of what we know and understand about how learning and development should be embedded in the work that people do. This is really surprising research, given that previous research suggests that this on-the-job experience is typically the most effective form of development. It's so interesting, this. Why could this possibly be happening? Steve Hunt at SAP Technologies really wonders to himself, and I found this quote on LinkedIn. Perhaps it is that employees are feeling burnt out by constant stretch assignments at work. As a result, perhaps they might welcome having some more dedicated time just to learn. If I put myself into the shoes of an employee like that, I think given the pandemic that we've just gone through, whether we have been working at home or perhaps we are now back at the office in some sort of hybrid working arrangement, I think for a lot of people that has been incredibly stressful and incredibly difficult. Then to want to throw learning interventions on top of that, where people are struggling to set down clear boundaries between work life and home life. In many respects, we see work life and home life, or the whole notion of work-life integration, really be turned on its head. And more, what we see is things like burnout, is things like unnecessary stress, unnecessary meetings being booked in diaries. If I take my mind back to even a year ago, if I wanted to have a discussion with my boss, my manager, or someone who reported into me, chances are I couldn't just walk into their office because I was working from home, given this pandemic. I had to book a meeting into their diary. What would happen if I just wanted to get a simple piece of information? By Monday morning, my diary would be full of meetings. On top of the meetings that I had to do, gosh, after a day of meetings, I still had a day of work ahead of me, essentially. So it's these kinds of stretch assignments, potentially, that are potentially making employees really value the idea and notion that I just want to take this time to develop myself. So potentially I want my organization to send me on some training, whether that is through an external provider or internal training. I want to close my emails on my laptop. I want to turn my laptop off. I want to get out a notepad and a pencil and start taking some notes for myself. Take that time to really develop myself. Such a fascinating finding. So this type of research is very much in its early stages. Very much in its early stages. So we cannot definitively provide an answer that most employees prefer having that space and time to do the learning yet. Very much cutting edge. So let's see how this develops in the next sort of 6 months to a year. I thought I'd start there before I introduce the topic of learning styles and how understanding different learning styles and preferences are incredibly important in terms of how we do our work and research. Qualtrics offers, in some other research that they've done, a slightly different view. So we need a blend of both. So we need a blend of this on-the-job learning in the flow of work, as well as the specific time set aside for learning to occur. Number one, we need to make some time and space to develop a learning culture in organizations. 2, we need to leverage the power of ownership. Number 3, and this is incredibly important for us as learning practitioners, We need to budget for learning and training and find opportunities to build up and get budgets signed off for our learning interventions in organizations. Number 4, in terms of people's learning, we would like to see much more of a push towards progress and not perfection. Number 5, for us as L&D professionals, we need to remember that development is a practice, right? So getting people to have that opportunity to experiment with what they are learning, apply what they are learning, but very importantly, to think about what they're learning as well, is critical for us. So developing people is very much practice that takes time, and we are not working towards perfection and mastery necessarily, but rather getting a few steps ahead of where we were previously. And number 6, at the end of the day, for us to be able to get budgets signed off, to be able to demonstrate the return on investment in learning, that learning needs to be put back into the flow of work, and it needs to be put into context in terms of the organization's context. What is the culture of the organization? Does the learning programs and the learning solutions that we are building, are they tied in with the culture of our organization? Very important. Very important. Moving on. I'd like to introduce you, if you haven't heard of this gentleman before. His name is David Cole, and in many respects, he's the father of what we call experiential learning. As we start to move into learning styles, we need to understand what experiential learning is all about first. So Kolb says that learning is the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. So we need to understand, according to Kolb, that learning is a cycle of experiences before we can start to understand learning styles. And there are absolutely key thoughts that are of importance here. There are concrete experiences when we learn. And in particular, looking at these types of different learning experiences we can have in organizations in particular. So if we look at corporate organizations and corporate learning specifically, concrete experiences, what is it that people learn on the job? That is a concrete and real learning experience. There are also other opportunities for people to learn. Reflective observation. So that is building theory and building concepts and ideas and understandings and reflecting on what we have worked, or reflecting on the learning that has occurred, whether that learning has occurred in the flow of work or whether that learning has occurred in the classroom. It doesn't really matter where the learning is, but just reflecting on what we have learned. We can start to build learning in that manner. Then with regards to abstract conceptualization, that covers people like me. So my learning preference, and we'll talk about learning styles in a moment, is abstract conceptualization. Can I start to build some theories and some explanations around what it is that I'm learning? And lastly, active experimentation. With the concepts, ideas, tools, methods, frameworks that I've learned, can I play around with those and experiment with those? Just in the playing around and experimenting with what I've learned is a learning process in and of itself. Two acronyms you might see on your screen is LIFO and LIFOT. LIFO refers to learning in the flow of work. LIFOT refers to learning in the flow of thought. So much of the learning that happens in the flow of work, that's on-the-job learning, are really around concrete experiences and active experimentation. Learning in the flow of thought is much more around me reflecting on what I am learning and building ideas and building theory and concepts around that. I just want to see Theo saying that he can't see the screen. Can everyone else see the screen, my slides?
Your screen is visible.
Thank you. Thanks, Genevieve. So, what are learning styles? Cole argues that we must first understand learning as a cycle of experiences, as I've mentioned, before we can understand learning styles. There are 4 main learning styles. There are others, and these are quite different to learning modalities. And I'll talk about learning modalities a little bit later on and how they're different from learning styles. First and foremost, you get diverging learners. Diverging learners are people who see things from differing perspectives, right? So somewhere in between concrete experiences and reflective observation. These are people who prefer watching to doing and are able to use their imagination to be creative in their overall approach to learning. This learning characteristic is, of course, a concrete experience, and at the same time, it's a reflective observation, right? So the 4 key learning styles almost exist in between the different kinds of learning experiences that we can have. Secondly, you have assimilating learners, right? These are people who are able to explore and analyze models well. I'm an assimilating learner. They are more interested in concepts and tasks than potentially in people relationships. Their characteristics could include abstract conceptualization and reflective observation. I consider myself to be very much an assimilating type of learner, and I'm going to give you access to a survey that you are able to do to understand your own learning style. Number 3 is converging learners. They learn best through active experimentation and abstract conceptualization. These people are generally really good problem solvers. They're seen as being quite practical in their analysis of ideas and tasks. And really, they tend to converge, and that's why they're called converging learners. They tend to converge on the answers that they want and are characterized, as mentioned, by abstract conceptualization and active experimentation. Accommodating learners. These are often the learners that do well with regards to on-the-job learning. These people tend to be really practical in their outlook on learning. They like to see problems from an intuitive point of view rather than a theoretical perspective. They might rely a lot on gut feeling, and they like newfound challenges, again, characterized by concrete learning experiences and active experimentation. So those are the 4 key learning styles, and I think it's very important to mention that a person can be more than one learning style. This is really about the question of biases, and biases in a good way. And I think if I look at myself, I am mostly an assimilating type of learner, but that doesn't mean that I cannot benefit from convergence, from accommodation, or from diverging. So I'm mostly an assimilating learner, but I'm not completely an assimilating learner. And really what this speaks to is my preference in terms of how I learn. This is absolutely critical for L&D professionals. When we design our learning interventions, or when we buy them in through a service provider, do we know what the learning styles and learning preferences are for the employees that we're about to put onto a learning program? Do we understand what those learning styles are? And in terms of the solutions that we put together, are those going to speak directly to those learning styles and preferences? Why would we want to do this? Really, so that those employees benefit as much as they can from the learning, that we're not missing the mark, not so much in terms of the content that is delivered, but how that content is delivered and how it's going to speak effectively to what is important to them from a learning perspective. This is important. The whole argument and development of learning styles is not a new idea. This was developed by Kolb in 1984. So this idea is heading on to 40 years old. We just haven't really applied it in any meaningful way to corporate learning. So much of innovation, in my view and in my opinion, is not about coming up with new content and new things. So much of innovation, and particular in learning, is about trying new combinations of things to get different kinds of results and outcomes. That's what's so exciting about taking learning styles differently. Are we good? Are we comfortable so far? I think discomfort can be equally as important as comfort with content. Thanks to Mola. Thanks, Awele. Thanks, Justina. Should we move on to the complex slide? I think it's time. This is the most complex slide I have for you. As I mentioned earlier, understanding learning styles has a huge implication for the type of interventions we offer our employees and how customized to need, potentially, and fit for purpose the learning intervention is. So, there were another group a little bit later than Cole. Two gentlemen by the name of Honey and Mumford. So this is in 1991, about what's that, 7 years after Kolb, who developed on Kolb's theory of experiential learning and developed 4 even more simple learning styles. But you can see how they are related to Kolb's 4 main learning styles. Right? You have your under diverging learners, according to Kolb. For Honey and Mumford, you have your reflectors. Reflectors just want to review the experience. Perhaps they say to themselves, I just want to be cautious and careful here and just review what I've learned before I take any next steps. Theorists, on the other hand, so I'm a theorist, that's my learning style, most effectively, say to themselves, I want to draw conclusions from what I'm experiencing. My thinking is, in terms of what I've learned, if it's logical, then it's good. Right? That's the kind of thought process of a theorist. If it's logical, it's good. I'm not too worried about if it's practical or if it's implementable. If it's logical, it's good. Pragmatists are often very different to me. They're converging learners. Pragmatists want to plan next steps. And they often say to themselves, gosh, there must be a better way to do this. So I've learned X, Y, and Z. This is a particular process. or system I'm looking at in the organization. There must be a better way. I want to put together some thoughts and concepts, and then I want to go and test them. I want to go experiment with them. And lastly, activists. Activist learners want to have an experience. They want to be able to take what they've learned and go and apply it and see what the outcome is. Activists often say to themselves, I'll try anything once. I'll try anything once, see what the result is. And if it works, great. If it didn't, that's cool too. I'll try something else next time. Such a beautiful way to understand learning styles. So we might have heard, and Demola did mention it in some of the social media posts for this particular session. We've heard of visual and auditory as well as kinesthetic learning modalities, right? These are not learning styles. These are modalities. These are biases. These are not learning styles, right? Chances are, if I'm a diverging learner / reflector, if I'm an assimilating learner / theorist, probably visual and auditory learning modalities might suit me better, maybe. If I'm more of an accommodating / activist learner, or a converging / pragmatic learner, kinesthetic, right? That's using my body, that's kind of taking action, that's physically doing stuff, might be a little bit better oriented towards me. But I think for me, the world of learning is so much more rich when we really understand, really understand learning styles rather than learning modalities, right? What I'd like to talk to you about a little bit is a learning ecosystem. So practically speaking, what does this mean for you as a learning and development practitioner or an HR practitioner or an HR head? We can start to design several learning interventions that speak directly to learning styles. So for example, for your accommodating learners, perhaps the focus should be on that ongoing, on-the-job implementation, right? Perhaps maybe there is an aspect of coaching that might be useful there. However, that might not be the most preferable approach for your diverging and assimilating learners. Perhaps a formal learning intervention, i.e. a course or a program, either offered internally or offered by an external service provider, might be preferable. They might get more from a formal learning intervention than they might get from on-the-job implementation. Similarly, for your assimilating and converging learners, perhaps customized and individualized where we can do it, learning and these collaborative learning experiences, social learning experiences, might be preferable to them. They might get a lot more out of a conversation around a particular new idea that they have learned than they would get out of a formal learning program or on-the-job implementation. And lastly, for your converging and accommodating learners, perhaps a learning program is not appropriate. Perhaps trying to force on-the-job implementation and on-the-job learning is not the most appropriate. Perhaps mentoring and coaching can provide that opportunity for them to really experiment a little bit more effectively with what they are learning. Try to apply it in safe ways to the job environment and see what the result is, and then potentially change, shift, change direction, try something new, stop doing something, start doing something. So really a much deeper understanding of how we can start to connect learning styles and learning preferences to actual learning interventions that we run for our organizations. Putting everyone on a leadership development program over 6 months might not necessarily be the right approach for everyone. Some people, you might lose some people along the way, and they might not say anything, but arguably we have not taken the opportunity to understand what those particular learning styles are and to be able to provide a service that's going to speak to those learning styles most effectively so that the learning lands incredibly effectively. Easier said than done. We do want to understand what the result of these various different learning interventions were and how well we did with regards to building learning interventions and opportunities that spoke to those different learning styles in the organization. We want to find some way to measure that. Focus groups are generally a good way to do that. Interviews. I mean, I think there's limited information you can get from a survey, but at the end of the day, often we are incredibly busy people with incredibly tight timelines. Sometimes it's not possible to have a discussion with a learner post-program to understand how effective that program or that particular learning intervention was. Sometimes we just have to push out a survey. I want to talk a little bit about learning personas. Once we have established the various different learning styles in our organization, a good idea is to group these people together into learning personas. Well, what is a learning persona? A learning persona is not a management level. It's not an area of technical specialization. It is not just demographics on its own. Age, gender, race, for example, region, location. What a learning persona is that understanding of what are the different needs and wants of learners in our organization, employees, and how can we group them together to be able to deliver learning interventions at scale in the organization. If you work for a big corporate organization that has 5,000 employees, it can be really difficult to develop individual learning experiences based on individual learning styles for each person in the organization. I think that's pretty much impossible unless it's all self-directed learning. But let's say if we have done some research and we've collected some data on what the different learning styles are, what the learning needs and preferences are, we can start to group people into a few different learning personas and push the appropriate type of content towards those learners. So let's say we have a group of assimilating learners who are maybe a little bit older. They are, sort of 45 to 55 years old. They've been at the organization for a long time. They really like grappling with some theory, some traditional leadership models. Putting them into a business simulation might not necessarily be the right approach. Just some examples on some learning personas. So 2 that I've developed here, and these are quite common ones in organizations. One is the rapid learner, and the other is the slow burn learner, for example. The rapid learner is probably going to have an undergraduate degree. They're a bit younger, they're highly self-aware, maybe they're really confident, but they don't necessarily know how to get up to the next level in the organization. Maybe they've been there for 2 to 3 years and they're feeling quite stuck. That's a particular learning persona. And this particular person, or this group of people, really wants to experiment with what they learn? Is putting them on a leadership development program going to necessarily be the right thing? On the other hand, is putting them through highly technical, skills-based training going to be the right thing for this particular person? Long term, probably not. On the other hand, the slow burn learner is completely different. The learning styles, preferences, needs, and wants of a slow burn learner are very, very different to those of a rapid learner. Chances are they're probably going to be a little bit older. Maybe they've got a postgraduate qualification, or maybe they don't have a qualification at all. They've just got a lot of experience, and they would appreciate a little bit more of a traditional approach to learning. Again, putting them through a coaching process might not necessarily be the most effective thing for them. Really, this is about awareness. I'll pop this link into the chat. If you go to Mint HR's website, you are able to go and understand your own learning style using Honey and Mumford's free survey. It's very, very interesting. It takes about 15 minutes to complete, and it's free. Maybe as next steps, maybe you want to push this out to your staff, or take that particular survey, put it into your own survey tool, whether you use SurveyMonkey or whether you use Microsoft Forms or whatever it is. Put it in and see what the results are. See what learning styles they are about, learning preference they are about. It'll be interesting to see. It'll give you a good indication of whether your current set of learning interventions are going to land, and if they're going to land well or not. Folks, I'm mindful that we are running out of time. There's one more slide that I want to share with you. Not this one, talking about capabilities, academies, and if we had more time, I'd talk more about capability academies. But suffice to say that Capability Academies and Africa People Advisory Group, we run an HR Capabilities Academy. These are beautiful because they cover all 4 main learning styles in some way, shape, or form. There's a bit of coaching, there's a bit of e-learning, there's an action learning project. That's your learning in the flow of work. There's short masterclasses. There's thought leadership that we provide. There are case studies, comprehensive practical workshops, and mentorship circles. You've got all 4 leadership, all 4 learning styles that are covered there. And it's not about leadership level. It's not about technical skill and ability. And it's not about having to sit and endure months and months and months of classroom-based lectures, which are fine for some learners, but completely inappropriate for others. Lastly, I wanted to wrap up by saying, what do we do in terms of next steps? Potentially, what do we need to build? What do we need to buy? And what in our organizations can either be built or bought? And this is just my opinion, folks, but I think internally, this is about building capacity of learning and development practitioners in the Nigeria market, in Nigeria-based organizations, or in multinationals who have a footprint in Nigeria. We need to learn how to build learning journeys. We need to learn how to build learning personas. We need to understand learning styles. Perhaps we need to learn how we curate the right kind of content that's going to land with the right kinds of learners. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to build all the content, but we need to understand how to curate that content and choose the right kind of content. Perhaps what we need to do is learn how a learner management system or a learner experience platform is actually going to benefit us before spending a lot of money on actually doing it. Who's going to manage that LMS? What is their background? Are they a really good learning practitioner? Do they understand learning styles? Practically speaking, who is actually going to manage that learner management system? Who's going to enroll people? Who's going to drive engagements? These are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. And in terms of buying stuff for learning and development, if need be, just buy in the learning and development consulting if you need different systems and processes and strategies set up. Buy in skills-based assessments if you need them. Buy in learning styles assessments if you need something more comprehensive than the Mint HR one. You might want to buy in that leadership development, management, and skills-based development programs. You don't necessarily need to build all of the stuff internally. And I think what can be chosen in terms of whether we build or buy, I am a little bit more in favor of building this up ourselves. Let us build the strategic and operational capacity for delivering great learning programs and learning interventions. We might need to build technical training. We might need to build mentorship and coaching, but equally for mentorship and coaching, we might want to buy that in. We might want to build, but it might be easier for us to actually just buy in a post-intervention assessment tool to understand return on investment. And that is all that I have for you today.